The letter arrived on a Tuesday, on a breeze that smelled like cut hay and distance. It rode in a courier's satchel scuffed by long miles, its flap sealed with a circle of red wax stamped S for Shaw, a tidy mark over untidy business. Sterling Rhodes turned it over in his hands like a man weighing a coin he wasn't sure he wanted to spend. The envelope was crisp. The feeling in his gut was not. He slid it with his pocket knife and read it once clean through, then again slower, letting the words settle where his instincts would not. We acknowledge your inquiry and accept your generous arrangement. Our daughter, Clementine, is of suitable temperament and practical mind. She will arrive by wagon on Thursday at sundown. Clementine. The name rang true and false at the same time. True because he'd heard it once years back at Peterson's trading post, when a harried mother had snapped, "Clementine, leave that filthy animal be." False because the letter spoke like it was ordering flour. Temperament. Practical, no mention of the girl herself. No mention of the soft, stubborn way she'd cupped a stray dog's jaw between gentle palms, tearing clean white petticoat into bandage strips as if linen was cheaper than mercy. No mention of the look in her eyes when she thought nobody saw, the look of someone who loved the world, even when it did not love her back. Sterling set the letter on his oak desk and listened to the silence of the house press in. The big room had a good, honest emptiness to it. Beams he'd planed himself. A stone hearth he'd layered rock by rock with hands that blistered and healed and blistered again. But evenings had a way of making even the soundest timber ring hollow. He'd built fences that held cattle against stampede and sky. He'd not yet built anything that could pen in loneliness. He read the letter a third time, tripping again over the one word that felt like a stone in his boot. Suitable. Folks used suitable when they meant safe to ignore. Folks used temperament when they meant won't talk back. The Shaws wrote like they were selling him a harness, not sending him their own flesh and blood. He wasn't naive. Mail-order marriages ran on terms and timetables, on dowries and distances, but in his bones he wanted something truer than a ledger line. Something that remembered the way afternoon sun had cross-hatched dust motes around a girl kneeling in dirt to save a dog nobody would miss. The courier took his water and rode on, and Tuesday leaned toward evening. Outside the open window, the rangeland breathed. Meadowlarks stitched thin silver threads of song through sage and bluestem. The sky had that high western look, so wide it promised everything and nothing at once. He could marry this girl called temperate and suitable, and hope the word Clementine still meant the person he'd glimpsed at a distance, or he could crumple the letter, toss it into the fire, and keep company with the wind. He set the letter flat, smoothing the crease with his palm. Fire was for lies. Letters deserved a chance. Sterling stood, the chair legs whispering across plank floor. "All right," he said to the house, to the cattle lowing somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, to the wild that always listened. 2 days. 2 days to turn a bachelor's refuge into a place a woman might want to breathe. 2 days to make his quiet look like welcome instead of neglect. He got to work with a vigor that surprised him. By first light Wednesday, he had every window thrown wide. The curtains snapped back like sails. He beat rugs over the fence rail until they coughed dust like old sinners confessing. He scrubbed the kitchen table until the grain shone, then set a vase in the center. Blue-glazed clay he'd found in a box of his mother's things after the funeral. He didn't own much that could be called pretty, but the vase was a start. He put water in it and went hunting among the cottonwoods for anything that passed for flowers this late in the season. He brought back sprigs of rabbit brush and purple aster, arranged them awkwardly, then rearranged them until the room felt less like a bunkhouse and more like a promise. In the small back bedroom, he stretched fresh linens across the mattress and smoothed them with the flat of his hand. Sheets held memory more than folks admitted. These would start clean. He hung a mirror on the wall, a simple rectangle with beveled edges, and caught his own reflection. Dark hair a little too long at the nape, jaw bristled from a shave he'd put off a day too many, eyes the color of watered coffee gone strong again. At 28, he had more fence than neighbors, more acres than conversation. People in town said he'd married the land and that it had taken his last name. Maybe. Land gave back what you put in if you did your part. It was a tough bride, but a faithful one. Still, he had built this house with space set aside that looked empty when he ate alone. He couldn't pretend he hadn't. Work filled the day like water seeking its level. He patched a hinge on the back door so it wouldn't squeal. He mended a tear in the sitting room curtain where sun had eaten the cloth thin. He sorted the books on the shelf by some private logic. Trail journals next to his mother's Bible. Dime novels he'd never admit to buying tucked behind a sturdy almanac. He simmered a pot of stew that smelled like thyme and patience, and the parts of a steer less noble than steak, but more honest than hunger. The house began to feel less like a room he visited between chores, and more like a place a person could rest. Every so often his thoughts circled back to the name. Clementine Shaw, he mouthed it slow. Names were contracts, he believed, between the bearer and the world. But he had read enough contracts to know what ink could hide. The letter never said kind, though he'd seen it with his own eyes. It never said brave, though the girl had ripped good cotton without flinching. It said suitable because suitable asked no questions and broke no glass. Questions had a way of splintering the nice, neat table of other people's comfort. He'd learned that buying the Morrison place, a tract the banker's nephew had tried to pass under the table to a cousin for pennies an acre. Sterling had put his bid on paper, cash up front, and asked out loud in a room full of men who preferred whispers. Why's the price different for him than it is for me? The silence that followed had been cold and educational. He'd won the land. He'd also earned a list of people who stopped saying hello on Main Street. He didn't mind the cost of questions. What he minded was the thought of bringing a woman into a house where questions lived like third chairs at supper. He needed someone who could look a thing in the face and call it by its right name. The memory of Clementine's hands, capable, muddy, unconcerned with ladylike nonsense, fit like a puzzle piece that might make the picture make sense. Late Wednesday, thunder grumbled far off, more rumor than promise. He stepped out onto the porch and leaned against a post worn smooth where his palm always found it. Beyond the cottonwoods, the pasture rolled in long, patient breaths. A bay mare tossed her head, then settled. In the eastern dark, coyotes tuned their thin violins. He tried to picture her arrival as the letter scripted it. A wagon at sundown. A woman with practical mind stepping down to a practical life. He could already hear the careful talk two strangers trade. Yes, ma'am, no, sir. The scaffolding you build around a leap because the air between is high and you're both afraid to look down. He imagined setting her trunk by the door, ladling stew into bowls, and letting the warmth from the stone hearth do the first part of the talking. He imagined not asking the wrong questions too soon, and not ignoring the right ones too long. The lamp on his desk guttered and steadied. He went back inside and drew the letter closer, as if proximity could reveal what language had concealed. He studied the lines that named her as if they could confess. Our daughter, Clementine, is of suitable temperament and practical mind. It wasn't the name itself that bothered him. It was the way the sentence held it, pinned like a butterfly under glass, pretty and unalive. He'd seen that trick in contracts from men more polished than honest. You take a truth, you frame it with words, and somehow the framing makes it a different shape. Sterling folded the letter once, crisp, and slid it into the top drawer of the desk beside a coil of twine, a stub of pencil and the key to the tack room, a drawer for small things that mattered more than their size. He shut the drawer and felt the house exhale. Tomorrow would be waiting with its list of chores and its absence of answers. The day after tomorrow would bring a wagon to his gate, and a woman whose name the letter had handled like a commodity. He banked the fire, doused the lamp, and let the dark climb the walls. In bed he listened to rain that never arrived. Sleep came in pieces, stitched with old scenes and new doubts. Peterson's yard bright with dust. A girl's palm on a dog's trembling flank. Sisters who'd laughed with their mouths and frowned with their eyes. A mother whose approval came like a late frost, deadly where it touched. He woke before dawn with the taste of the word suitable in his mouth like a penny held too long under the tongue. Thursday's sun would cross the sky same as any other day. Wagons came. Wagons went. Men worked. Women made homes out of four walls and whatever could be set inside them with care. But not every letter carried a future folded into it. Not every name rang like a bell struck true. He rose while the horizon was still a bruise and set coffee to boil. He shaved, careful, until the mirror gave him back a face that looked like it had made up its mind. He laid out 2 cups on the table, left a space between them wide enough for caution and close enough for hope. He checked the hinge he'd oiled, smoothed the sheet he'd already smoothed, and opened the front door to let the morning rush in. He stood there a long time, watching the road that cut the pasture like a rule you could follow if you wanted your life to stay straight. A meadowlark landed on the fence post and sang as if the world were simple. It wasn't. He could live with that. In 2 days, he said to the empty room that would not be empty much longer, to the land that had kept his secrets and his company, to the sky that made every man honest about his size. In 2 days she arrives. He paused, hand on the door jamb, thumb worrying the grain like a rosary. Then almost to himself, as if saying it quiet might make it less true, but something is wrong with her name. At the Shaw homestead, supper dishes still cluttered the table when Charles Shaw unfolded Sterling's letter for the 4th time that day. His fingers left smudges in the wax, as if pressing harder could make the words say more than they did. Margaret Shaw sat stiff-backed, her blue eyes bright with something too sharp to be relief. Their daughters, Victoria and Isabel, hovered like hawks at a fence post waiting for the strike. Sterling Rhodes, Charles muttered, the name heavy in his throat, owns the Morrison place, half the county by now. Rich enough. Ambitious enough. Wants a wife. Then perfect, Margaret said. Her voice clipped as she stacked plates with unnecessary force. A prosperous rancher willing to take a girl like her. We should thank Providence for small mercies. Victoria leaned forward, pale hair glinting in lamplight. Father, you mean to send him Clementine? Of course he does, Isabel cut in, laughing without warmth. Who else? She's been nothing but thorns under our roof since she learned to speak her mind. Let Sterling Rhodes break his hands on that stone. Mind your tongue, Charles snapped. But not because she was wrong. His gaze slid to the dark hall beyond the kitchen door, where a single lamp still burned in the sick room. Clementine had spent hours by her grandmother's side, reading psalms to ears too old to catch them all, sponging fever from a brow wrinkled by both age and regret. She doesn't need to know the details, Charles said at last, folding the letter and sliding it into his vest. She leaves Thursday. It'll be better this way. Margaret's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile if cruelty wore softer clothes. Better for us, certainly. For 3 years she's been nothing but a liability. Do you remember the Henderson contract, Charles? We'd have cleared a fortune if she hadn't asked questions about where the money came from. Isabel's laugh was sharp. Or Judge Morrison's nephew. We might have had a seat at the territorial table if she hadn't dragged his drinking into daylight. Enough, Charles growled, though he didn't deny it. She asks too many questions. Always watching, always listening. Not natural for a girl. Margaret set down the plates with a thud. Not natural at all. But now, thanks to Sterling Rhodes, she'll be someone else's problem. And out of our sight. Silence stretched, broken only by the tick of the mantel clock. None of them noticed the shadow outside the kitchen door. Clementine stood pressed to the wall, her breath shallow, her heart thundering in her chest like a frightened horse. Every word fell against her skin like nettle, burden, shame, problem to be solved. She'd known for years her family looked at her sideways, but hearing it plain stripped the last veil from her heart. She stumbled back into the night air, gulping cool darkness as if it could wash the taste from her mouth. Stars stretched cold across the prairie, but none of them seemed meant for her. She slipped into her grandmother's room, shut the door, and collapsed beside the bed. The old woman's breaths rasped shallow but steady, her eyes closed, hands thin as twigs on the quilt. Clementine took one in her own, whispering so low even the shadows had to lean closer. I heard them, Grandmama. They're sending me away. Not for love, not for hope. Only because I won't keep my mouth shut, her throat burned. She thought of the Hendersons, faces pinched with worry as men in suits tried to rob them of land. She thought of the preacher's wife, clutching her bruised wrist until Clementine pulled it free. She thought of the countless small cruelties she'd refused to swallow. Maybe I do ask too many questions, she whispered. But I'd rather ask and be hated than be silent and loved for nothing real. The old woman stirred faintly, squeezing her hand with what little strength remained. For Clementine, it was enough. A benediction, a blessing, or perhaps just the last act of a woman who understood what truth cost in a world built on silence. By morning, the Shaws gathered around the breakfast table like judges pronouncing sentence. Charles cleared his throat and told her of Sterling Rhodes. Margaret smiled like a knife sheathed in silk. Victoria and Isabel looked anywhere but her eyes. Clementine nodded when expected, spoke little, and let them believe she was meek. But behind her quiet stare, fire gathered. They thought they were sending her away as punishment. What they didn't know was that freedom sometimes arrived in the form of exile. And as the wagon wheels rumbled closer with every hour, Clementine Shaw swore she would carry her questions into whatever future lay waiting. Because questions, unlike lies, had the power to break chains. And so on Thursday, while her family smiled their painted smiles and waved her away, Clementine already knew. This marriage was not an end. It was the beginning of something none of them could yet imagine. Thursday broke with skies the color of tarnished silver, a sharp wind whipping dust across the yard. The wagon waited out front, the driver tugging at his hat against the cold. The horses stamped and snorted as if they, too, were impatient to be gone. Clementine stepped onto the porch with her single trunk. Her belongings fit easily into it. 2 dresses, a worn shawl, a leather-bound book of psalms, and a ribbon once tied around a dog's paw 3 years past. It wasn't much, but it was everything that was hers alone. Her family gathered as though for a performance. Charles adjusted his vest, already looking past her toward fields that might yield profit. Margaret's smile was brittle porcelain, edges sharp if you touched it too close. Victoria and Isabel stood shoulder to shoulder, pretty and polished, their faces painted with polite sympathy that felt more like victory. "Sterling Rhodes is a good man," Charles said, voice heavy with practiced solemnity. "You'll be well taken care of." "It's a blessing, truly," Margaret added, her eyes flicking to the driver as if to hurry him. "Not every girl is so fortunate." Clementine looked at them one by one. Father, mother, sisters. She saw no grief, no hesitation, no love, only relief. Relief at a burden lifted. She inclined her head, lips forming the words they wanted to hear. "Yes, Father. Yes, Mother. I'll do my duty." Inside, her chest burned. The driver hefted her trunk into the wagon bed and offered a calloused hand. She took it without flinching. As the wheels creaked into motion, she turned once, just once, back toward the porch. Her family's faces blurred in the morning light, and she realized she felt no need to memorize them. What she left behind wasn't home. It had never been. The road stretched long and brown ahead, twisting through cottonwood groves, over dry creek beds, past ranch fences leaning tired against the prairie wind. Clementine let the rhythm of the wheels carry her thoughts. She remembered every accusation whispered behind her back. Too stubborn, too curious, too honest. She thought of Henderson's land, the papers she'd found tucked into her father's desk, numbers that didn't add up. She'd spoken up, cost him a fortune, and earned herself years of cold stares at supper. She thought of Judge Morrison's nephew, his hand heavy on his wife's arm, the bruises she'd dared to name aloud. Her sisters had hissed at her to stay quiet. Her mother had called her reckless. But the woman had thanked Clementine with tears in her eyes the very next day. Every truth she had carried had cost her something. Yet as the wagon rattled westward, she felt something like pride bloom beneath her ribs. If the world punished honesty, then perhaps honesty was worth the punishment. The hours lengthened. The driver chewed tobacco and spat into the dust, silent except for the click of reins. Clementine kept her eyes on the horizon, where heat shimmered and land rolled away without end. She imagined Sterling Rhodes waiting at the other side, tall, serious, his hands rough with work. She wondered if he remembered the trading post, the dog, the way her family had dragged her away. She wondered if he'd seen her, truly seen her, or if he only wanted a bride that could silence his loneliness the way her family wanted to silence her voice. By late afternoon, the sun sagged into gold. Shadows stretched long across the rangeland. Her heart beat faster with every turn of the wheels. Beyond a line of cottonwoods, smoke curled upward, a thin gray column marking hearth and home. The wagon slowed and her breath caught. The house rose from the earth solid and unpretending, timber walls square against the endless sky. Fences held herds in the distance. horses grazing with tails flicking lazily. The smell of stew drifted faint on the wind. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't grand. But it looked honest, and then he stepped out. Sterling Rhodes. Taller than she remembered, broad-shouldered, hair a little too long at the nape. His eyes, brown, steady, searching, met hers as the wagon rolled to a stop. For a moment, the world shrank to the space between them, a space charged with something neither had words for yet. He moved with deliberate care down the steps and reached up as the driver braked the team. His hand, strong, calloused but careful, extended toward her. "Miss Shaw," he said, voice low and certain. Her fingers slid into his and he steadied her down from the wagon. The touch was brief, but it sent warmth climbing her arm. She looked up into his face, saw recognition there, and replied simply, "Mr. Rhodes." The driver lowered her trunk with a grunt. Sterling nodded his thanks but kept his eyes on Clementine. Something unspoken passed between them, something that felt larger than a bargain struck by letter. As dusk painted the sky in purple and flame, Clementine realized two truths at once. She had been cast out by her own blood, and she had just set foot on the ground where her life might truly begin. But Sterling Rhodes had secrets of his own, secrets that would test whether this fragile spark could survive the storm, already rolling their way. The wagon rumbled away, wheels fading into the distance, leaving only the smell of dust and the echo of hooves. Sterling lifted Clementine's trunk inside with a quiet strength that spoke more than words. He set it near the front door, then straightened, brushing dust from his hands. "You must be hungry," he said, not as an obligation, but as a fact observed. "There's stew on the stove." "Bread, too." Clementine's reply was a small nod, her voice caught somewhere between gratitude and weariness. She stepped into the ranch house, her boots striking wood worn smooth by years of one-man solitude. It was nothing like the Shaw home. There was no lace for show, no polished silver to impress. Instead, sturdy chairs circled a table that bore knife marks and candle stubs. Books leaned unevenly on shelves, their spines cracked from reading rather than display. The stone hearth glowed with the warmth of a fire tended with care. It was not fine. It was not false. It was lived in. Sterling ladled thick stew into bowls, the scent of thyme and beef filling the room. He cut bread with deliberate strokes, setting a slice beside her bowl before serving his own. They ate in silence at first, the scrape of spoons against earthenware the only sound. But silence between strangers carries weight. Clementine felt his gaze settle on her more than once, not appraising, not the way men measured women as stock, but curious, as if he were trying to see whether the woman at his table matched the shadow memory of a girl kneeling in the dirt for a wounded dog. Finally, he spoke. "Your family spoke highly of you." The spoon paused halfway to her lips. Clementine set it down carefully. "Did they?" A small smile tugged at his mouth. "Actually, no. Your father was eager to make arrangements, but he said little about you. Your mother called you practical." "Practical." Clementine repeated the word, tasting its bitterness. "That's one way of saying unremarkable." His eyes met hers across the table, steady as oak. "I remember you from Peterson's trading post 3 years back. You tore strips from your own petticoat to bind a stray dog's paw. Mud on your hands, dress ruined. That wasn't unremarkable." Heat rose in her cheeks. She had assumed no one remembered, least of all this man. "You remember that?" "I remember thinking anyone who'd ruined good cloth to save a dog was someone worth knowing." Even when her family tried to pull her away, her chest tightened. All these years she had carried that moment like a scar, proof she would never fit the mold her family demanded. Yet here was a man who had seen it and called it worth. "Why my family?" she asked quietly. "Why did you write to them?" Sterling leaned back, his spoon forgotten. "Because I've been looking for someone real. Someone who sees the world for what it is, not just what's convenient to believe." His words hung between them, heavy as truth, light as hope. The fire popped in the hearth. Clementine looked down at her hands, at fingers roughened by chores, at the faint pink line where a dog's tooth had once grazed her skin. For the first time, she wondered if those hands might be seen not as clumsy, but capable. She dared to lift her gaze. "And what do you see now?" Sterling's answer came without hesitation. I see a woman who asks questions when silence would be safer. I see someone who's carried truth even when it cost her. Her breath caught. She had never heard herself described that way. Not by her parents, not by her sisters, not by anyone. The stew cooled between them, untouched. Something warmer rose instead, something unspoken but undeniable. Sterling shifted, his voice quieter now. But I'll be honest, Miss Shaw. When I wrote that letter, I wasn't just searching for a wife. I had other reasons. Her heart tightened. Other reasons? He held her gaze, eyes darker now in the firelight. Your father's business dealings. I've heard whispers, land trades that didn't add up, deals that hurt more than they helped. At first I thought marrying into the family might give me answers. Her hand froze on the rim of the bowl. The truth lay naked between them now. He had sought her family for knowledge, not companionship. Yet he hadn't stopped there. He hadn't left the confession to rot unspoken. And now, she asked, her voice thin but steady. Sterling exhaled, long and slow. Now, I think I was wrong about what I needed. The more I speak with you, the less I care about your father's dealings. And the more I care about something else entirely. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The fire flickered, shadows dancing across the walls. Clementine sat in silence, heart pounding, knowing that something fragile had begun to root between them, something that could either wither in suspicion or grow into trust. But outside those sturdy walls, the prairie carried whispers too, and whispers had a way of riding into town before a man could stop them. Morning came early on the prairie. The sky turned the color of watered milk before breaking into gold. Sterling was already outside, checking fences, when Clementine stepped into the cool dawn air. She wrapped her shawl close, the hem of her dress brushing damp grass. "Coffee's on the stove," he said, voice carrying over the yard. Then softer, when he noticed her eyes scanning the horizon. "But if you'd rather walk, I'll show you the land." She nodded. "I'd like that." They walked side by side, boots crunching over dry soil, the smell of dew and cattle hanging in the air. Sterling pointed out corrals, barns, the broad pasture stretching to the cottonwood stand where cattle grazed. His words weren't boastful. They were matter of fact, the way a man spoke of something built with sweat instead of signatures. "How long did it take?" Clementine asked, shading her eyes against the rising sun. 5 years. Started with nothing but my mother's Bible and a patch of scrub. Land'll reward you if you give it everything. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but always honest. The word struck her, honest. Not a word her family used much. Not a word she had ever heard directed toward her in kindness. She rested her arms on the top rail of a fence, watching a mare nudge her foal. "And me? Why did you write my father? Not Victoria, not Isabel. You knew them too." Sterling leaned on the fence beside her. He didn't answer right away. His gaze followed the horses for a long moment before he spoke. "Because 3 years ago, I saw a girl ruin her dress to save a stray dog. I figured anyone who'd trade silk for mercy might be worth more than 100 women with perfect smiles." Her chest tightened. She remembered that day, the way her family had pulled her away, ashamed, while she'd whispered to the frightened animal. She hadn't known he was watching, and, he added quieter now, "because I heard enough about your father's dealings to want the truth. At first I thought you might be the way to it." The confession landed heavy. She turned, searching his face. "So you wanted answers. Not a wife. I thought I did." His eyes held hers. "But I was wrong." Silence stretched between them, thick as the morning mist. Clementine's breath caught, her pulse drumming like hooves in her chest. "What do you want now?" she asked. Sterling's hand closed gently over hers on the fence rail. His touch was warm, rough from work, steady as the land itself. "Now? I want to know the woman who doesn't look away from hard truths. I want the kind of life where silence isn't safer than speaking. I want you." Her throat tightened. Words failed. Instead, she let her hand stay beneath his, trembling but unwilling to pull away. When she finally looked up, his face was closer than she realized. His eyes searched hers. Not for permission he assumed, but for permission he needed. She rose on her toes, closing the space between them. Their lips met in a kiss that began soft, tentative. Two strangers testing ground neither had crossed. But when Sterling's arms circled her waist, pulling her against the steady thrum of his heartbeat, the kiss deepened. fierce and certain. It felt less like discovery and more like recognition, like coming home after wandering lost. When they parted, breathless, Sterling rested his forehead against hers. "No going back now," he whispered. Clementine closed her eyes. "I don't want to." For a heartbeat, the world shrank to two people and the fence between them, the sky above vast and endless. But the prairie never stayed quiet for long. A flicker on the horizon caught Sterling's eye. A rider cresting the far ridge, dust trailing like smoke. He stiffened, jaw tightening. "Someone's coming," he said. Clementine turned, shielding her eyes against the rising sun. The rider's shape grew clearer with each passing moment. Whoever it was, they were riding fast. Her hand gripped his arm, steady but tense. "Do you know him?" Sterling's silence was answer enough. The kiss had made them more than strangers. But the rider on the ridge was bringing news that would test whether that fragile bond could survive the storm galloping their way. The rider reached the ranch just as the sun climbed high. Dust clung to his coat, sweat streaked the horse's flanks. Sterling recognized him before he dismounted. Elias Carter, a man who wore the Shaw family's coin in his pocket and their favor on his tongue. He swung down, boots striking the earth with too much noise. "Rhodes," he called, his voice loud enough to rattle fence posts. "Charles Shaw sends his regards and his warning." Sterling's jaw set. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely between the rider and Clementine. "Say what you came to say." Elias pulled a folded paper from his coat, waving it like a weapon. "Word spreading in town. Folks say you brought Clementine Shaw here under false pretenses, that you're digging into her family's business, trying to ruin Charles Shaw with his own daughter's tongue." Clementine's breath caught. The accusation cut too close to truth, twisted though it was. Sterling's voice was iron. "I don't answer to whispers." "But the town does," Elias sneered. "And they're saying you lured her here for information, that you mean to shame her family, a good girl's reputation." He let the words hang, venom sweet on his tongue. Clementine stepped forward before Sterling could reply. Her voice was steady, sharper than the rider expected. "A good girl's reputation? You mean your employer's pride?" "My family sent me here because my questions cost them profit, because I told truths they'd rather stay buried." Elias blinked, thrown by the force in her tone. "Careful, girl." "No," she said, her chin lifting. "Careful is what they've demanded of me all my life. Careful while they cheated neighbors. Careful while they smiled at widows they left hungry. Careful while their dealings bled this county dry." Sterling glanced at her, something fierce and proud in his eyes. But Elias only spat in the dirt. "You do well to remember, Miss Shaw, that truth won't keep a roof over your head. And in this town, it might just burn it down." He mounted again, tugging hard at the reins. "There'll be a hearing in town tomorrow. Folks want answers. You'd best come ready." With a kick, horse and rider vanished in a cloud of dust. Silence stretched. Clementine felt her pulse racing, the weight of Elias's words pressing down. Sterling touched her arm gently. "You didn't have to speak up." "Yes, I did." Her voice trembled but held. "They'll twist everything if I stay silent. Lies thrive when no one names them." That night, the ranch felt less like refuge and more like a fortress under siege. Sterling stoked the fire, the glow throwing his features into sharp relief. "Tomorrow," he said, "they'll try to break us. Your father's influence runs deep. But the truth—" He paused, meeting her eyes. "The truth has teeth, Clementine. If you're willing, we'll bear them together." She sat straighter, firelight catching the steel in her gaze. "Then let them call their hearing. I'll not cower while men like Charles Shaw rewrite the world in their favor." Outside, coyotes howled in the dark, high, lonely, and defiant. The next dawn would bring the town together, not for justice, but for judgment. And Clementine Shaw would stand where no woman in her family had dared stand before, beneath the weight of her own truth. The depot at Dry Creek was never meant for crowds. It was a place of freight and departures, not trials. But that morning, half the county stood shoulder to shoulder beneath its wooden awning, farmers in dust-stained hats, merchants with tight mouths, wives whispering behind gloved hands, all waiting, all watching. Clementine stepped down from the wagon Sterling had driven, her boots hitting the dirt with quiet finality. The weight of 100 eyes pressed against her back. Her sisters would have curtsied, smiled, pretended at grace. Clementine only straightened her shoulders and met the stares head-on. Charles Shaw stood near the platform, flanked by Elias Carter and two other men whose pockets jingled when they shook hands. His voice carried slick as oil. "My daughter's been misled. Sterling Rhodes lured her with false promises, hoping to pry into private dealings. I come here today not as a businessman, but as a father, seeking her return and the protection of her name." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sterling's fists tightened at his sides. Clementine felt the air grow heavy, like thunder waiting to break. She stepped forward before anyone could stop her. "You speak of protection, Father," she said, her voice ringing clear. "But you never protected me. You silenced me. You punished me for seeing what others pretended not to see." Gasps broke from the crowd. Charles's jaw snapped tight, but she pressed on. "When Henderson's farm was nearly stolen by false papers, I spoke. When Judge Morrison's nephew laid hands on his wife, I spoke. When you cut deals that filled our coffers while neighbors went hungry." She turned slowly, letting the crowd hear every word. "I spoke." Faces shifted, some pale with anger, some wide with shock. "You call me misled. But I've never seen more clearly than I do now." She lifted her chin. "Sterling Rhodes did not lure me here. He offered me something my family never did: honesty." Charles's hand slammed against the railing. "Enough, she's young, confused." "Am I?" Clementine cut him off. Her voice did not waver. "Or am I the only one willing to say aloud what this town has whispered for years?" A tense silence settled, until a new voice rose, thin but strong. "I'll speak to that." From the edge of the crowd, a woman stepped forward. Her bonnet was plain, her dress patched, but her eyes carried fire. Clementine recognized her, the wife of Judge Morrison's nephew. She clutched a small Bible like a shield, but her voice carried unshaken. "My bruises faded, but her truth saved me," the woman said, nodding toward Clementine. The preacher's wife, she was skimming the fund. Clementine proved it. "And when the bank tried to cheat us of our land, she stood between us and ruin. This girl sees what others turn from, and maybe that frightens some of you." But I call murmurs shifted again, this time softer, questioning. Charles's face flushed, sweat beating at his temple. "Lies," he hissed. "All lies." But then another voice joined, a rancher from the back. Then a storekeeper. Stories spilled one after another, of Clementine's quiet interventions, her questions that had saved livelihoods, her truths that had cut through comfort. The tide was turning. Sterling stepped beside her at last, his hand brushing hers, steady and unashamed. "You've heard enough to know the kind of woman she is. If that frightens some, so be it. But I'll take her truth over another man's silence every day." The depot fell quiet, as if the prairie itself held its breath. Charles opened his mouth to retort, then froze. A small glinting object had slipped from his vest as he moved. It landed with a dull clink on the platform. A ring. Sterling stiffened. He knew that ring. His mother's. It had gone missing after the Morrison land sale years ago. Eyes turned. Charles scrambled to snatch it up, but too late. The crowd had seen, and in that single moment, suspicion hardened into certainty. The truth had teeth, and now it had drawn blood. But in the ashes of her father's ruin, Clementine Shaw would have to choose: vengeance or the fragile new love she had just begun to claim. The depot fell into stunned silence. Charles Shaw stood pale and shaking, his hand clutching the stolen ring like it might erase what everyone had just witnessed. But the crowd had already seen enough. The rancher who had spoken earlier spat in the dust. "That's a Rhodes family ring. I remember it." Others nodded, voices swelling, accusations, anger, betrayal. The tide had turned, and this time there would be no smoothing it over with coin or charm. Charles stammered something about misunderstandings, about lies, about a daughter too wild for her own good. But the words fell limp. His influence, once strong as barbed wire across the county, snapped under the weight of truth. Clementine stood straight, her hands at her sides, her voice calm. "For years you told me my honesty was shame. Today it set me free." Charles's eyes burned, but Margaret's face told another story. For the first time, the brittle mask cracked. Fear, not anger, flashed in her gaze. She tugged her husband's sleeve. "We should go." And go they did, climbing into their wagon under a hail of whispers, their backs rigid as if pride could shield them from shame. Elias Carter followed, his smirk gone, his hat pulled low. When the dust settled, only Clementine remained on the platform, the crowd's eyes still fixed on her. For the first time, she didn't shrink. She lifted her chin, steady as the prairie wind. A merchant's wife stepped forward, voice soft. "It takes courage to say what you said." More courage than most men here. The murmurs that followed were not scorn, but respect, quiet as rain soaking into dry earth. Sterling moved to her side, his hand brushing hers. Not a question now, but a vow. "You've done what no one else dared. You've given them truth. And what will you give me, Sterling Rhodes?" she asked, her lips curving at the edge of a smile. He didn't hesitate. A home built on it. Weeks later, the wedding was small. Just a traveling preacher, 2 ranch hands, and a handful of neighbors who had seen her courage firsthand. Clementine wore her cleanest dress, patched but neat, her hair braided with care. Sterling wore his Sunday shirt and boots polished to a shine. There were no flowers, no lace, no family gifts. But when they stood together beneath the open sky, the vows spoken were more honest than any sermon. As the preacher closed his Bible, Sterling took her hands and said, low enough only she could hear, "They thought they sent me a burden. They gave me the only gift I ever needed." Clementine's throat tightened. "They wanted me gone, Sterling." He smiled, boyish and fierce all at once. "Then their loss is my forever gain." That night they sat on the porch beneath a sky heavy with stars. The land stretched endless around them, a quiet kingdom built not on coin but sweat and stubbornness. Sterling's arm wrapped around her shoulders, her head resting against him. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. She laced her fingers with his and shook her head. "Only that it took us 3 years to find our way here." "Well," he said, kissing her hair, "we've got the rest of our lives to make up for it." The night air was cool, the prairie alive with crickets and the far-off howl of coyotes. But inside that porch light's glow, there was warmth enough to outlast winter. Clementine closed her eyes and let the truth settle like a promise. She was no longer a burden, no longer a problem to be solved. She was a wife, a partner, and, for the first time, a woman seen for exactly who she was. If you believe truth can build a home, then stay a while. There are more stories of courage, love, and the Wild West waiting just beyond the next horizon.